She said it like a secret she hoped I'd believe. "You're too poor to be wearing this, Iverna." Her hand was already on my chest, fingers closing around the small silver cross that had once belonged to my mother. The room went quiet. Every sound, every breath seemed to wait for me to answer. I didn't. I'd learned too well how silence could pass for grace, how it could make cruelty look civilized. It wasn't the first time she'd done it, reached for something that wasn't hers and called it love, stolen something sacred and called it order. I had stayed quiet for years, telling myself I was protecting peace, keeping what little family I had left from breaking apart. But that night, when her nails scraped against the metal, I understood what I'd really been doing. Peace built on silence isn't peace, it's surrender. So I let her have her moment, her smile, her false victory, because deep down, I knew something she didn't. That would be the last thing she ever took from me. The hum of the test chamber was steady, like the breath of something alive. I set my coffee down and watched the drone hover midair, its blades slicing the light into thin, silver ribbons. The sound used to calm me, mechanical, predictable, the way machines always did what they were built for. People were harder. My phone rang, Houston area code. My father's voice, soft, a little worn. He said Margaret wanted to redo the gallery room, that there were some things I might want to see before she organized them. I didn't ask what that meant. I just said I'd drive down over the weekend. I went for him, not her. The Collins house sat under a wide Texas sky, the same porch swing, the same peeling paint, but everything inside felt staged, like the home I remembered had been replaced with its photograph. The air smelled faintly of lavender, not the cedar polish my mother used. The stairway creaked under my boots. On the wall where my mother's portrait used to hang, a new frame gleamed. My father and Margaret. Her smile bright, triumphant, his hand tucked politely around her waist. The brass plaque beneath read James and Margaret Collins, a new chapter. She appeared in the doorway before I reached the landing, wearing a pale silk blouse that matched her voice. "Oh, the prodigal daughter returns." Her words floated out smooth, practiced. "We kept your room tidy, though I did turn it into a guest room. I hope you don't mind." I smiled, the kind of smile that buys time. "It's your house now, isn't it?" "Oh no," she said, touching my hand lightly. "Ours." Her palm was cool. Her eyes weren't. For a moment, the space between us felt airless, like the instant before a plane breaks sound. That night, unable to sleep, I went to the old cabinet in the study. My mother's things were stacked in boxes, some marked donate, others already sealed. One metal tin caught my eye, dented, but familiar. Inside lay the distinguished flying cross, silver edges dulled by dust. I sat with it on my lap, brushing off the years. The engraved wings caught the lamplight, and for a heartbeat I could see her again. Her steady hands. The quiet pride that never needed applause. The door clicked open behind me. Margaret leaned against the frame, barefoot, holding a glass of wine that caught the same light as the metal. "That's a beautiful piece," she said, stepping closer. "It shouldn't sit in a drawer." "Iverna? Something like that deserves to be seen." I didn't answer. "Your mother received it, right? For your father's service?" I nodded once. "Then it's a family symbol. Dear. A legacy." She smiled, the kind that never reached her eyes, then turned and left. The scent of Chardonnay lingered in the air, a sweetness that felt more like varnish than warmth. I sat there a long time, watching the light slide across the silver. My mother once told me that silence could be a kind of dignity. I used to believe her, but that night, staring at the metal in my hands, I wondered if silence was only another word for letting someone walk right over you. Sometime past midnight, my phone buzzed on the desk. A headline blinked across the screen. Margaret Hale Collins to host Houston Veterans Charity Gala, celebrating families of Air Force heroes. Below it was a photo of my father and her beneath the national flag, honoring decades of service from the Collins family legacy. Not a word about the woman who'd once stood in my father's place to receive that medal. Not a word about me. just her. I locked the screen and sat back, the drone of the ceiling fan whispering above me. The house was quiet, but not the kind that soothes. It was the quiet that comes before something breaks. 2 weeks passed before I returned to Houston. The heat pressed down thick as syrup, the air humming with cicadas and humidity. Margaret had filled the calendar with meetings, invitations, and phone calls. Everywhere I looked, her name was attached to something that had once belonged to us. That afternoon, I helped my father sort through the boxes stacked in the garage. The air smelled like motor oil and sawdust, the scent of his old workshop. He sat on a stool, hands trembling slightly as he leafed through fading photographs. I dug deeper into one of the cartons marked archives, pulling out a worn leather-bound notebook wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. The moment I opened it, I knew what it was. My mother's handwriting, looping and neat, each page carefully dated. The last entry described the day she'd received the Distinguished Flying Cross on my father's behalf. She'd written about the rain that afternoon, how it soaked through her shoes, but not her pride. She wrote about how the medal felt heavier than she expected, how she'd clutched it to her chest and promised to keep it safe until he could stand again. I sat on the concrete floor, fingers tracing her words until they blurred. My father called my name, asking for a wrench. I tucked the journal under my arm and told him I'd bring it inside later. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet for how large it was. I was reading through more of the diary. The ink faded to sepia, when a faint whirring sound caught my attention. At first, I thought it was the ceiling fan, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was the printer. The light from the living room spilled into the hallway. I followed it, barefoot, heart thudding faster with each step. Margaret stood by the desk, her silk robe brushing the floor, a glass of wine in one hand, the printer spitting out pages in the other. The glow from the lamp softened her face, but her eyes were alert, calculating. "Oh, Ivy," she said, startled just enough to make it look convincing. "I'm putting together a slideshow for the gala. These old notes are perfect to show your mother's devotion to James." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "They're private." She paused, tilting her head. "Private memories become public pride when shared, don't you think?" Her tone was smooth, like a teacher correcting a child. The printer beeped once, then stopped. She picked up the stack of papers, fanned them gently, and smiled as if admiring her own cleverness. I watched her fingertips skim over my mother's handwriting, the same way you'd test fabric for quality. The gesture made my stomach tighten. I wanted to grab them back, but before I could, my father's voice drifted in from the hall. "What's going on in here?" Margaret turned, her smile instant and immaculate, just preparing the tribute. "Darling." He nodded, rubbing his temples. "She's doing something beautiful for our family." He didn't notice the look I gave him, half disbelief, half plea. Margaret handed me one of the printed sheets, her expression almost tender. "See? She wrote so lovingly. I think people will adore this part." The paragraph she pointed to was my mother's note about faith, about how love meant protecting what mattered, even when no one applauded. I folded the paper once, twice, until it disappeared into my palm. Later, alone in my old room, I placed the folded paper back into the journal, closing it tight as if I could lock the words away again. The printer hum still echoed in my ears. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of my mother standing in the rain, medal in hand, her voice calm but firm. "Don't let anyone else write your story," she said. I woke before dawn, the words still ringing in my head, sharper than any alarm. The Houston Officers Club was all glass, gold, and practiced laughter, the kind of place that smelled like polished ambition. I arrived just before 4, and the parking lot already gleamed with imported cars lined in perfect symmetry. Inside, chandeliers sprayed light over silk and sequins, reflecting off champagne glasses raised in mid-conversation. Margaret had outdone herself. The banners, the floral arrangements, the string quartet, every detail bent toward elegance. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her glide between tables, hand resting lightly on my father's arm. her pearls winking under the light. She knew how to command a room, not with warmth, but with control disguised as grace. When the microphone crackled, all chatter died. She stepped up to the podium, smile perfectly measured, tone soft enough to suggest humility, but sharp enough to hold power. Ladies, the Collins family is honored to host this year's Veterans Gala. We represent courage, service, and legacy. Applause filled the hall, polite and hollow, the kind that lives in surface-level admiration. I clapped once, just to blend in, but my hands stayed cold. The word legacy hit like static in my ears. Around me, conversations resumed, the metallic clink of cutlery, murmurs about donations and committees. The air felt thin, the kind that made you aware of every breath you took. I slipped toward the back of the room, pretending to study a display of framed photographs, most of them Margaret and my father, smiling at events that had begun to erase any trace of the life before her. A woman in a silver dress turned toward me, her smile syrupy and well-rehearsed. "You're the stepdaughter, right?" I heard she was the one who helped her husband through combat trauma. For a second, I didn't understand. Then it landed. She wasn't my mother. The woman she was talking about was standing a few feet away, basking in borrowed glory. I nodded because silence was easier than correction. The woman smiled wider, pleased with my agreement, and drifted off. I stood frozen, pulse steady but heavy, like holding breath underwater. From across the room, Margaret caught my eye and lifted her glass, a silent toast I couldn't return. My father leaned in as someone whispered in his ear. He laughed softly, proud, unaware that the story being told wasn't his anymore. After the luncheon, she found me by the door. "You should smile more," she said, her tone sweet as sugar melting over steel. "The press will be around. Why do you keep saying we when you mean you?" "Because, dear, people believe unity, not division." She walked off before I could reply. Her perfume, lavender and confidence, trailed behind her, the kind of scent that lingers long after its owner leaves the room. I stayed a few minutes longer, watching the photographers pack up their lights, listening to the faint echo of Margaret's voice in my head. Unity, not division. I wondered if that's what she called it when she replaced someone's story with her own. That evening, Houston's skyline glowed orange as the sun slid behind the skyscrapers. I sat in my car outside the club, scrolling through my phone. The event was already online, press coverage faster than I could drive home. There she was, front and center, Margaret and my father, hand in hand beneath the American flag. The headline read, "The Collins Legacy, a family of air and honor. Not a single mention of my mother. Not one word about the woman who'd stood in the rain 30 years ago, accepting that same medal on my father's behalf while he recovered in a military hospital." I turned off the screen and drove in silence. The city lights blurred through the windshield like runway lights in fog. When I got home, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new paint. Margaret's touch was everywhere. A fresh centerpiece on the dining table, silver picture frames perfectly aligned along the mantel. My father's voice called faintly from the den, laughing at something on television. I walked to the living room and stopped short. The wall once lined with old photographs, my mother's smile at the beach, my father in uniform. Me holding a model plane was now a shrine to Margaret's version of history, awards and plaques re-engraved to include her name. A new sign hung above them in gleaming brass letters. The Margaret Collins Family Foundation. It was like walking into a museum built on ruins. I stood there long enough for the laughter from the den to fade into background noise. Then I saw it, on the lowest shelf, half hidden behind a vase of artificial orchids. One photo frame turned face down. I pulled it out carefully. My mother, in a sky-blue dress, holding the flying cross close to her heart. The glass was cracked diagonally across her face, as if someone had set it down too hard, or wanted to forget her without saying so. I brushed the dust from the corner and held it to the light. For a second, she looked alive again, gentle, steady, strong, the kind of strength that didn't demand to be seen. Margaret's laughter drifted faintly from upstairs. I could almost picture her there, glass of wine in hand, rehearsing her next speech about unity. I placed the photo upright on the mantel, between a silver candlestick and a new family portrait where my mother didn't exist. The contrast felt like defiance. "They'll remember you again. Mom, I promise." The room stayed silent. But outside, a low rumble of a plane rolled across the night sky. The sound vibrated through the windows, deep and distant, like a reminder. Rain slicked the streets outside the Houston Officers Club, leaving reflections of chandeliers trembling in puddles. Inside, the air was a cocktail of perfume, bourbon, and old pride. Every corner gleamed under soft gold light. Waiters moved in rehearsed lines, balancing trays of red wine. Laughter floated through the room like static, too sharp to be real, too polished to be kind. I sat near the end of a long table, my dress simple, my glass untouched. From where I was, I could see Margaret sweeping through the crowd. Her hand looped around my father's arm, her face framed in confidence. She glowed as if she'd been painted for this room. And, in a way, she had. When she reached the microphone, her voice cut through the chatter with effortless authority. "Everyone," she began, "this is my stepdaughter, Iverna. She used to work around the Air Force. She's a genius with machines." The word around landed with precision, deliberate and cruel in its softness. It drew polite laughter from nearby tables, the kind that stung because it pretended not to. I smiled the way soldiers do when a superior gives an order that makes no sense. Controlled, neutral, unreadable. Margaret's hand rested over my father's, her ring catching the light. He looked proud, content even, as though she'd just spoken a truth worth celebrating. After the speeches, as people drifted toward the bar, a woman I barely knew leaned close to me, her voice dripping with champagne sympathy. "You must be proud, dear. She speaks so highly of your father's bravery, and you take after him, right?" I nodded once. My throat felt like cold metal, the kind you taste when you bite back words you can't afford to say. 2 days later, the call came before dawn. My father had collapsed in the kitchen. The doctor called it a minor cardiac episode, the kind that scares you more than it damages you. I drove to the hospital before sunrise, signed every form, paid every bill. By the time Margaret arrived, the crisis had passed. She came sweeping through the hallway in a black coat, tulips in hand, dark glasses hiding what she probably hoped looked like grief. Her heels clicked like punctuation marks. "Oh, Ivy handled everything," she told the nurse, voice pitched for sympathy. "We're a family that stands by our veterans." I stood at the end of the bed, my jaw tight. My father's color had returned, faint pink spreading back into his face. He smiled at her, like a man too tired to question the comfort he's being handed. A week later, the Houston Daily Chronicle arrived on my porch. The headline took up half the page. Margaret Hale Collins, the woman behind the hero. She recently donated $20,000 to the Veterans Hospital in her husband's honor. There was a photograph beneath it. My father, frail and pale, standing beside her. Her hand rested over his heart, as though she had kept it beating. I was not in the picture, though I'd been there the entire time. The article went on about her devotion to service, her leadership in the military community, the inspiring love story that continues to define the Collins name. By the time I reached the end, I couldn't tell which part burned more, the lies or the silence surrounding them. That evening, I found my father in the living room, the paper folded neatly beside him. "Dad, she's using your name and mine to build hers." He sighed, leaning back, eyes fixed somewhere past me. "She's helping the community. Ivy, that's all that matters. At the cost of Mom's memory?" He didn't look up. "Your mother's gone. Let's not make life heavier than it already is." The air between us went still. I waited for him to take it back, to say something that sounded like defense, like truth. But he didn't. I walked outside before I said something I couldn't take back. The rain had returned, soft and steady. I stepped into it, barefoot on the porch, the cold seeping through me. The flying cross rested in my palm, its metal catching the weak porch light. Water beaded along its edge, silver against silver. For a moment, I thought of my mother holding it under a storm just like this, refusing to let it rust. I'd spent years believing silence was noble, that keeping the peace was a kind of love. But peace had turned into erasure, and love had turned into the perfect excuse for someone else's story to overwrite mine. If I stayed quiet, I wouldn't just lose the memory of her, I'd lose myself along with it. Inside, I heard Margaret's voice, soft laughter, footsteps on tile, the sound of ownership, the sound of winning. I closed my hand around the metal until its sharp edges bit into my skin. The sting steadied me. The storm thickened, wind shaking the trees, rain turning the driveway into mirrors. I stared at my reflection in the water, a blurred outline of someone who had disappeared from her own history, and whispered to the dark. Though no one could hear me, not anymore. From the window behind me, the house glowed warm and golden, like a photograph of happiness. But to me, it looked like a stage set lit for someone else's applause. And somewhere in that brightness, under the false laughter and the practiced kindness, I could feel it beginning. The quietest war I'd ever fought. It wouldn't have gunfire or medals or speeches, just truth, waiting in the shadows for its moment to be heard. The wind picked up just after sunset, warm and restless. Clouds hung low over Houston, heavy with the kind of rain that never really started or stopped, just lingered. I'd stayed late at the office, half burying myself in numbers and schematics, trying not to think about the newspaper headlines still folded in my bag. But the quiet didn't last. My phone vibrated on the desk, screen lighting up with a name I hadn't seen in years. Sender, Captain Ellis Rayner, saw something odd at the press preview for the Veterans Gala. You should take a look. I opened the attachment before I could think. It was a photograph, bright, crisp, painfully staged. Margaret stood beneath the national flag, smiling as though she'd earned the light that fell on her. She wore a tailored Air Force uniform, one I knew too well. The same cut, the same insignia, my mother's. Pinned to her chest, unmistakable even through the screen, was the flying cross, my mother's medal, my mother's story. The caption read, Margaret Collins, representing the Air Force legacy. For a long time, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't shock exactly. It was something slower, colder, like realizing your pulse has stopped, but your body hasn't caught up yet. Everything that had once belonged to us, our pride, our sacrifice, our name, had been stitched into her costume. The screen dimmed, but I could still see the image behind my eyes. I grabbed my keys. Rain started as I turned onto my father's street, thin and persistent, tapping against the windshield like fingers drumming on glass. When I parked in front of the house, every window glowed soft and golden. From outside, it looked peaceful, an illusion I no longer believed in. Through the living room window, I saw her. Margaret stood before the mirror, one hand on her hip, the other holding a half-empty glass of wine. She turned slightly, admiring her reflection. The uniform fitted perfectly to her frame. I opened the front door without knocking. "Take it off," I said, my voice low but steady. She turned, the kind of turn people make when they already know they've been caught but don't intend to stop. "Oh, Ivy. It suits me, doesn't it? That uniform belonged to my mother, and she's gone, dear. Legacies should live on." I stepped closer, enough to smell the wine on her breath, enough to see the faint shimmer of powder where the collar met her neck. "You're stealing her story." "Stories don't belong to the dead," she said, still smiling into the mirror, only to those who can tell them well. Her reflection met mine in the glass, both of us framed in that narrow pane of light. The silver gleam from the metal hit her cheek, harsh and cold. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that showed you everything wrong with the world and asked you to stay polite about it. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I'd never wanted to hit anyone in my life, not even now, but I wanted her to feel it, the weight of what she'd taken, the gravity of it. She sipped her wine and adjusted the collar. Perfectly calm. The sound of footsteps broke the air. My father entered, slower than I remembered him moving, his face pale from medication or guilt or both. What's happening here? He asked. Your daughter thinks I shouldn't honor your service, Margaret said lightly, turning to him. I'm just saying she shouldn't fake it, I replied. He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. Please, both of you, let's not turn this house into a battlefield. The word battlefield hung in the room, bitterly ironic. Once, this home had been a sanctuary for a soldier's family. Now it was just another war zone, quiet, polite, and suffocating. Margaret placed the glass on the table and rested a gentle hand on his arm. You see what stress does, James? We're supposed to be preparing for the gala, not this. He nodded, exhausted. She smiled, victorious. I looked at him then. Really looked. A man who'd built aircraft engines, who used to talk about aerodynamics like poetry. By the first week of June, Houston felt like a furnace. The air didn't move, it pressed. Heat clung to skin, to glass, to thought. Even the house seemed to creak under it, as if holding its breath before something gave. I woke early that morning, already restless. Coffee gone cold beside me. My inbox chimed. The subject line read, Veterans Alliance, confirmation for Mrs. Margaret Collins, keynote speaker. For a second, I thought it was spam. Then I saw my own email copied underneath, a courtesy CC meant for whoever handled the original application. My stomach tightened. I opened it. Dear Mrs. Collins, it began. We're honored to have you as our keynote speaker. The program looks forward to celebrating the Collins family legacy. The salutation hit me like a shove. Mrs. Collins. I had been the one invited. My name had been on the list from the start. I picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the email. The receptionist's tone was bright, oblivious. This is Captain Iverna Collins. I believe there's been a mistake. I was the one invited to speak. A pause. Faint typing sounds. Oh, Mrs. Collins told us you transferred your slot to her. I froze. My own pulse sounded mechanical in my ears. She lied. I said, steady but sharp. Another pause. Well, ma'am, the program's already printed. When I hung up, the heat in the room felt heavier, not weather anymore, pressure. Margaret hadn't just claimed my name, she'd rerouted an entire narrative. Officially and publicly, the world would hear her version of the Collins story, and there'd be no trace of mine. That afternoon, I drove to my father's house. The kitchen smelled like butter and sugar, a domestic sweetness that almost masked the tension underneath. Margaret stood at the counter, apron tied neatly, mixing dough with precise, performative care. The light through the window caught on her pearls, a sharp gleam against her skin. You had no right to take my spot. I said, It's a family affair, dear. Her tone was mild, dismissive. She didn't look up. You forged my name. She smiled faintly. You mean our name? She turned then. Eyes cool and exact. The curve of her lips honed to an edge. You see, Iverna, people believe in stories, not spreadsheets, and I happen to tell better stories. I stared at her hands, floured, deliberate, kneading the dough the same way my mother used to every Memorial weekend. My voice came out low. Those stories weren't yours to tell. She laughed lightly, brushing flour from her hands. History is public property. Dear, only the living get to decide how it's remembered. The words landed like heat stroke. A few days later, an email alert blinked on my phone while I was at work. Withdrawal notice. $15,000 from Collins Family Fund, joint account. I called my father immediately. Dad, did you withdraw $15,000? Margie said she needed it for the event deposit, he answered, his voice weary but unbothered. Don't worry, Ivy, she'll pay it back. That's Mom's fund, I said. You shouldn't. Please, not this again. She's doing good things. I hung up before he could continue. The aftertaste in my mouth was metallic, bitter. She wasn't just rewriting history, she was cashing it in. Every check, every plaque, every donation became a receipt for her false legacy. And my father, once an engineer who could detect the smallest flaw in a design, didn't see what was breaking right in front of him. That night, I sat at my desk, fingers drumming against the table, the sound sharp and hollow. I scrolled through the gala website. The homepage had changed again. There she was, Margaret Hale Collins, listed as recipient's wife, who accepted the medal on behalf of Captain James Collins. Rhett. It wasn't just false. It was surgical, precise. The phone rang close to 9. I almost ignored it until I saw the caller ID. Captain Ellis Rayner, my father's old commanding officer. I picked up. His voice was rougher than I remembered, gravelly but clear. Ivy, I thought you'd like to know. They're listing Margaret as the recipient's wife who accepted the medal. That's not right, is it? I couldn't answer at first. I swallowed, throat tight. She's rewriting history, I said quietly. Then rewrite it back. He replied, the truth doesn't survive silence. The line went dead, but the words stayed. They filled the room, the way oxygen rushes back into a space after a door opens. I sat there a long while, the hum of the air conditioner steady in the background, the evening thick with unspoken things. The clock ticked, each second sharp as a nail. Rewrite it back. It wasn't anger I felt. It was recognition, a simple, sudden clarity. The same kind you get when turbulence stops and the plane steadies, and you realize you've been gripping the armrest long after you're safe. Only I wasn't safe, not anymore. I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the box buried at the back. Inside lay my dress uniform, neatly folded, untouched for years. The fabric was stiff, clean, still smelling faintly of starch and rain. I ran my fingers along the collar. I laid it across the table, smoothing the creases one by one. The insignia glinted softly under the lamplight. For the first time in months, the sight didn't make me ache. It made me breathe. My mother had worn that truth like armor. My father had buried it under exhaustion. Margaret had packaged it into speeches and photo ops. But I still had the original blueprint, the version untouched by anyone else's agenda. Outside, thunder cracked over the city, sudden and loud, scattering the heat for a moment. I could smell the metallic promise of rain. I looked out the window, the skyline shimmering in the distance, and whispered to the glass, "She's built her empire on lies. I'll build mine on what's left of the truth." The wind picked up, rattling the panes. I folded the uniform again, carefully, as if I were preparing for a ceremony no one else knew about. The fabric cooled against my skin. The world outside pressed in, thick, heavy, unforgiving. But for the first time, I wasn't shrinking from it. I could almost hear my mother's voice again, that calm steadiness that used to anchor a room. Don't let anyone else write your story. I closed the box, the sound small but final, heat or no heat, storm or no storm. I knew what came next. The gala was still weeks away, but the real confrontation had already begun. Margaret had rewritten enough. It was my turn to take the pen back. 2 days before the gala, the air itself felt electric. Houston's sky hung low and swollen, the kind of gray that promised thunder but refused to break. The envelope arrived mid-morning at my office in Lockridge. The receptionist placed it on my desk like something fragile. Heavy cream paper, gold-embossed lettering, the kind of stationery that announced importance before it even spoke. Mrs. Margaret Collins, guest of honor, VIP access. The handwriting below was in ink that shimmered faintly under the fluorescent light. We look forward to hearing your family's story. Underneath a pile of files on my desk was a small maitate, worn photograph. My mother in a navy blue dress, holding the flying cross at the ceremony decades ago. Her expression wasn't pride exactly. It was steadiness, a calm that came from surviving more than anyone knew. I placed the photo beside the invitation. 2 versions of the same story, one real, one rewritten. I knew which one I'd carry forward. By noon, the first rumble of thunder rolled over the city. I closed my laptop, slipped the photograph into my bag, and made up my mind. It was time for my mother to be heard again. The storm hit in waves by the time I reached my father's house. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the long, drawn-out grumble of thunder. The air smelled of ozone and rain. I didn't knock. Inside, the house was lit up, warm against the gloom. Margaret's laughter carried down the hallway. She stood before a full-length mirror in the living room, wrapped in a silver gown that shimmered with every movement. A custom design. She'd called it in the last interview I'd seen. My father sat nearby, half hidden behind a newspaper, eyes flicking between the pages and the woman who had come to define them. "You're not going to that gala," I said, the words cutting through the hum of the air conditioner. "Oh, Iverna," she sighed, smoothing the gown along her hips. "The invitations are already printed. I represent this family now." "Represent?" I took a step closer. "You erased my mother from every photo." "Correction," she said, turning toward me. "I curated the story. Your mother was, how shall I put it, too quiet to be remembered." Something in me shifted then. Quiet but absolute. "Then I'll remind them." Our eyes met in the mirror, her reflection framed in silver, mine in shadow. The dress gleamed against the dark, but in that reflection, the contrast told the truth. One of us was dressed for performance, the other for war. My father set the paper down, his voice cracking slightly. "Stop, please. Don't do this here." He wasn't looking at either of us, just at the floor, as if avoiding the fight might make it vanish. I turned toward him, and what I saw wasn't anger. It was fear, not of conflict, but of embarrassment. The fear of losing face, the fear of breaking an illusion that had already begun to rot. "Peace built on silence isn't peace," I said quietly. "It's surrender." Neither of them spoke. The only sound left was the steady ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I left before either could find something polite to say. Back in Austin, the storm followed me. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky was black and restless, wind pressing against the windows. I turned on a single lamp and spread my dress uniform on the bed. The fabric smelled faintly of starch and cedar, of years folded away, but never forgotten. I smoothed each crease, my fingers moving slower than they needed to, as if the ritual itself meant something more than readiness. From the drawer, I took the flying cross and laid it against the fabric. The metal's silver surface gleamed even in the dim light, fitting perfectly against the dark blue. It looked right there, as if it had been waiting. The chandeliers of the Houston Grand Ballroom glimmered like frozen lightning, scattering light across the marble floor. Brass and strings from a military band drifted through the air, polished and ceremonial, every note rehearsed to perfection. Beneath it all was the faint, hollow hum of expensive conversation, wine glasses clinking, practiced laughter echoing against the walls lined with flags and framed medals. I stood at the entrance, the weight of my dress uniform grounding me. The collar was stiff against my neck, the fabric crisp, heavy with meaning. The flying cross caught the golden light above, throwing back a flash of silver across the tiled floor. People turned. Whispers began to thread through the crowd like static. "Isn't that the real Captain Collins?" I stepped forward, each heel strike against marble, a slow drumbeat. The sound of my boots didn't match the music. It cut through it, cold and deliberate. "On stage!" Margaret's voice filled the hall. "The Collins family has always stood for courage and service. I am honored to continue that legacy." Her hands floated over the podium, the perfect imitation of sincerity. My father sat in the front row, his shoulders small against the bright backdrop. I stopped at the end of the aisle, eyes fixed on the silver gleam across her chest, the medal that didn't belong to her. The room blurred around it, a single flashpoint of stolen honor. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The truth was already there, reflected in that stolen light. When the applause finally died, and the band softened into a waltz, Margaret stepped down from the stage, smiling like she'd just secured her place in history. She found me near the back, her perfume cutting through the air before her words did. "Iverna," she cooed, warmth dripping from her voice. "You came. How lovely." "You shouldn't be wearing that," I said, my eyes never leaving the medal. Her smile didn't waver, but her voice cooled. "Oh, dear." You're too poor to be wearing this. Before I could react, her hand darted out. Fast and practiced, she yanked the medal from my chest. The medal snapped against the pin, fell, and hit the floor. The sound was small but sharp. Metal on marble, echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped. Music faltered. All that was left was silence, the kind that fills your lungs until it hurts. Margaret stood frozen, the medal at her feet, her hand still hovering mid-air. For the first time, her poise cracked. A voice cut through the quiet. "Ma'am, that isn't jewelry!" Heads turned toward the sound. An older man stepped forward from the crowd, his cane tapping once against the marble. His uniform jacket, faded but immaculate, caught the light just enough to show his rank insignia. "That's a Distinguished Flying Cross," he said. "Captain James Collins' wife received it in '87. I was there. I turned. Colonel Ellis Rayner. His eyes found mine, steady, unwavering, and he gave a small nod. "She's the daughter," he said. "She earned the right to wear it." A murmur rippled through the room, spreading fast. Margaret took a step back, color draining from her face. The photographers, sensing blood in the water, raised their cameras. The first flash went off, then another. My father stood up from the front table, confusion twisting his features into something raw. "Margie," he whispered, voice cracking. "What have you done?" She turned toward him, desperate now, the veneer slipping. "It's a misunderstanding." Another flash, more murmurs. Someone gasped when the colonel's voice rose again, louder this time, firm enough to command the room. "You disgrace his name wearing that like decoration." The words landed hard, flattening whatever resistance Margaret had left. She blinked against the cameras, mascara trembling on her lashes. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small. I stepped forward. The crowd made room without realizing they were moving. My heels clicked once, twice, then silence again. The medal lay near my shoe, a small island of light against the dark marble. I knelt. The medal was warm from the stage lights, smooth where years of handling had worn it down. A thin layer of dust clung to the edges, catching the glow from the chandeliers. I stood, pinning it back onto my uniform. The clasp snapped into place with a sound that cut through the heavy quiet. I faced the colonel, then the crowd. "No, Colonel," I said softly. "It's not a misunderstanding. It's a revelation." The cameras went wild, white bursts of light. Overlapping questions shouted too late to matter. Margaret took a step backward. The silver fabric of her gown caught under her heel. For a heartbeat, I thought she might faint, but she didn't. She turned instead, her movements clumsy now, and hurried toward the side exit. The sound of her heels hitting marble echoed unevenly. Fast, frantic, wrong. I watched her go. The doors swung shut behind her, the music still dead, the silence still heavy. My father sank back into his chair, face pale. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. His hands were shaking. The colonel gave me another nod, quiet approval written in the lines around his eyes. I returned it, just once. The flashes continued, relentless. Reporters whispered. Some guests began to clap, soft at first, unsure, hesitant. But then others joined in, louder, fuller, until it filled the room. I walked to the podium, not because I'd planned to speak, but because silence had done enough damage for one lifetime. For years, this medal represented the service of two people, the man who wore the uniform and the woman who carried its weight when he couldn't. I said, my mother earned this, not because she fought a war, but because she fought for its memory. More flashes, more stillness. We don't choose our legacy, but we can protect it. And that's what I intend to do. I didn't say more. The truth didn't need dressing. It already stood taller than anything Margaret had built. As I stepped down, the military band struck up again, the melody shifting into something steadier, quieter, respectful. My father rose from his seat, moving toward me. His eyes were wet, his hand trembling as he reached for mine. But no words came. Across the room, the stage lights dimmed. The chandeliers flickered once, as if exhaling. The air felt different, lighter, clean. I looked down at the metal, the faint reflection of the room's golden light trembling on its surface. It wasn't just mine. It had never been. It was my mother's, my father's. And now it was whole again. For the first time in years, I stood tall, not as a daughter trying to defend a name, but as someone who finally understood it. When the last chord from the band faded, the room erupted into applause again. But I didn't look back. Margaret's voice, her lies, her careful rewriting, all of it had finally run out of air. I walked toward the exit, the metal warm against my chest. Every step a quiet reclaiming of something that had always been mine to begin with. Not just truth, but peace. A week after the gala, the city felt like it was holding its breath. The heat that had lingered for months finally broke, replaced by cold rain that clung to everything it touched. Houston was gray, washed out, as if the whole place was trying to rinse away what had been said and done. But some stains don't lift that easily. Every headline I saw carried her name. Charity leader exposed for faking military honors. Veterans outraged at socialites' fraud. Gala scandal shocks Houston's elite. Her photos were everywhere. Her in that silver gown, smiling under the lights, frozen in the exact moment before everything unraveled. The same publications that had once called her the face of the Collins legacy were now picking her apart. Columnists wrote about moral decay, about borrowed valor, about how the public loves a lie until it's forced to remember the truth. The Veterans Alliance issued a formal statement within days. The board dissolved her honorary title. Donations were withdrawn. Committees she chaired cut her name from every document, one by one. The doors she had built her world behind closed quietly. She stopped appearing in public, canceled interviews. The camera crews moved on to fresher scandals. For the first time, Margaret Hale Collins became what she'd always feared most. Invisible. Then my father called. I drove to the house under a steady drizzle, wipers thudding against glass. The porch light was dim, casting more shadow than warmth. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of paper and rain and something faintly metallic, maybe regret. He sat in his armchair, thinner than I remembered, a blanket over his knees. The TV was off. The newspaper lay open beside him, folded to the article that carried her downfall. He didn't look up when he said, almost to himself, "She made me small in my own house, and I let her." His voice was quiet, almost unrecognizable. "It's over." "Dad," I said, sitting across from him. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled something out, wrapped in a handkerchief, handled carefully. When he opened it, the silver gleam caught the light. "Your mother wore this," he said softly. "The day she accepted it for me. I should have protected that memory better." I watched his fingers trace the edge of the metal, slow and trembling. The years had taken so much from him, but this gesture, this small act of remembrance, felt like a restoration. "You just did," I said. He met my eyes then, and something unspoken passed between us. Recognition, maybe forgiveness, but mostly understanding. The truth didn't need defense anymore. It just needed to be honored. That night, the rain kept falling, tapping against my window like a steady clock. I couldn't sleep. There was a kind of quiet after victory that doesn't feel like triumph, more like exhaustion wearing calm as disguise. I sat at my desk, turned on the small lamp, and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. My hand didn't shake, but I paused for a moment before writing, wanting the words to land exactly where they should. "Margaret, you no longer have access to my father, our name, or our silence. I wish you peace away from what isn't yours. Ivernay, no anger, no bitterness, just the truth. Written plainly, the way my mother would have said it. I printed it, signed it, and slipped it into an envelope. When I sealed it, it felt final, a quiet verdict, a goodbye not to a person, but to the shadow she'd cast over us. The next morning, I left it at the post office, no return address, no second thoughts. 3 days later, a small package arrived. No sender listed. The handwriting on the label was elegant, deliberate. My stomach tightened the moment I saw it. Inside was a black velvet box and a folded piece of paper, written in ink that looked a little faded, as if the pen had trembled. People remember stories, not truth. I just wish I'd told the right one. I unfolded the tissue inside the box and froze. The flying cross rested there, polished to a shine I hadn't seen in years. Every edge gleamed, every surface spotless. It looked almost new, reborn from the ruins of everything it had been used for. For a long while I didn't move. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the rain against the glass. I held the metal up to the light, watching it reflect off the window, scattering small bursts of silver across the walls. It wasn't joy that filled me, not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter, something steadier. She hadn't returned it to surrender. She'd returned it because, for the first time, she saw what I'd been fighting for. The truth doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to win. It just needs to outlast the lie. I smiled faintly. Not because I'd beaten her, but because the story had found its rightful narrator again. Outside, the rain began to slow, the sky fading from gray to the faintest blue. I set the medal on my desk beside my mother's photograph, the one where she's holding it the first time. Her face calm, proud, alive. The medal caught the light again, softer now. The house was quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. And somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the clouds, I could almost hear her voice. Steady, certain, the way it had always been. Not every war is fought with weapons. Some are fought with memory. And this one, finally, was over. 2 years later, the air over Arlington carried the kind of quiet that belonged only to sacred ground. The autumn wind moved through the flags, setting them rippling in slow, solemn rhythm. Above, the sky was a deep, unbroken blue, the kind pilots always said was perfect flying weather. The Air Force Memorial gleamed in the distance, its spires catching the light like the tips of wings breaking free from gravity. I stood at the podium, a small microphone clipped to my lapel, the crowd stretching in careful rows before me, veterans in pressed uniforms, families holding photos, cadets standing straight despite the cold. On my chest, the flying cross caught the sunlight. The engraving beneath it was new. Captain James Collins and Evelyn Collins, in service and memory. The weight of it felt different now, not like burden or proof, but like balance. It didn't belong to grief anymore. It belonged to peace. I took a slow breath and began. Legacy isn't what we inherit. It's what we protect, and who we protect it from. The words came easy, steady, not rehearsed, but remembered. I talked about the quiet acts of courage that don't make it into textbooks, the wife who carried medals to ceremonies, the father who taught his daughter how to keep planes steady in crosswinds, the generations who keep stories alive even when others try to rewrite them. The crowd didn't move. The sound of flags flapping in the wind filled the silence when I stopped speaking. Then came the applause, slow at first, deliberate, and then rolling through the open air, grounding me in something that felt both heavy and light. I stepped away from the podium, the echo of clapping fading behind me, replaced by the hum of wind sweeping over the marble. After the ceremony, I moved through the crowd, exchanging polite nods, a few handshakes, quiet words from people I didn't know but somehow understood. When I looked up, I saw her. Margaret stood near the back, small against the wide horizon, a gray coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her hair, once perfectly styled, had turned soft white. She held the memorial program close to her chest. The edges crumpled slightly from her grip. For a moment, I thought she might leave before I reached her, but when our eyes met, she didn't look away. I walked over, the distance between us feeling both impossibly long and painfully short. She spoke first, voice fragile but clear. I was wrong, I know, I said, not asking forgiveness, just admitting it. I forgave you, I said quietly, the day I stopped needing you to understand me. For a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Relief. Maybe. Or release. Then she nodded, a small, tired smile pulling at her mouth. She turned toward the parking lot, her steps slow, her shoulders a little straighter than before. I watched her disappear into the crowd, the wind catching the edge of her scarf and lifting it like a small white flag. When the last of the guests left, I wandered toward the wall of names. The stone was cool beneath my fingertips, the etched letters catching the late afternoon light. James Collins, my father's name. He had passed the year before, quietly, in his sleep. I'd sat beside him in the hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, holding his hand while he mumbled half-dreamed flight coordinates. When he went, it wasn't with fear, but with the kind of peace only pilots understand, knowing the sky would keep moving without them. Colonel Rayner's reflection appeared beside mine in the polished stone. His hand came to rest gently on my shoulder. The sky keeps its records. "Captain," he said, "the rest of us just try to live up to them." I smiled, the words sinking deep. Maybe that was what legacy really meant. Not to be remembered perfectly, but to keep showing up for the truth. Again and again. The wind lifted, brushing past my collar, cool against my neck. The silver metal glinted in response, alive under the fading sun. The sky remembers. I whispered, even when people forget. I looked up. The clouds had scattered, leaving behind an expanse so blue it hurt to stare at it. Somewhere above, a jet traced a white line across the open air, straight and fleeting. For a moment, I imagined my parents there, two small figures breaking through the clouds, weightless, unbound, finally home. The world below was quiet again. Flags moved gently in the breeze. The stone wall shimmered under the last gold of the day.